Good afternoon and welcome to the Pervasive Media Studio online lunchtime talk. These are live every Friday at 1 p.m, beaming out onto your smartphones, laptops, iPads and living room televisions. My name is Fern Dunn and I'm the Communications Coordinator for the Southwest Creative Technology Network, otherwise known as SWCTN. These talks are our chance to throw open the digital doors of the Pervasive Media Studio and for you to hear more about the people who are part of our community or are working on things that excite us. An especially big welcome to those who are new to the studio, for whom this may be the first time you'll be engaging with what we do. For those newcomers, hi, and here's a little bit about what we do. The PM Studio is a diverse and collaborative community exploring creativity and technology, with everything from comedy to coding and product development to performance art. We're a partnership between Watershed, the University of the West of England, and University of Bristol. It's a home for early ideas, companies and a meeting place for both creative and commercial industries. A studio space offering desk space, meeting rooms, events and opportunities, all for free. And a safe place for artists to take risks in their practice and make time for collaboration. For the next month, the teams behind the Southwest Creative Technology Network and Bristol+Bath Creative R+D will be taking over the lunchtime talks, showcasing the work from their fellows and looking at everything from data to digital placemaking and responsible innovation. This week's talk comes from SWCTN, which is a project funded by Research England's Connecting Capability Fund, to link research to development by expanding the use of creative technologies and supporting business growth across the Southwest. For this week's talk, we'll be welcoming SWCTN Fellows, Kathy Hind, Matt Baker and Pete Quinn Davis for a panel discussion around data, nature and human health. There's a Q&A at the end, with the talk running at roughly around 30 minutes. But if you want to ask a question, just pop them into the chat window and I'll pick them up and ask our speakers afterwards. Or you can tweet your questions to @PMStudioUK. A captioned and recorded version of this talk will be available here after the talk is finished. And just to let you know, next week's talk is Data and the Human. In this panel, we'll be exploring the human relationship with data as a mirror, from how it helps us understand ourselves and others, to the consequences of data misrepresenting us or exposing aspects of ourselves we may want to keep private. You can get news on all our future talks by following us on PM Studio UK on Twitter or Pervasive Media Studio on Instagram, or subscribing to our newsletter on our website. Don't forget to subscribe to this YouTube channel and give the video a thumbs up, because the more subscribers we get and the more likes we get, the more we can share stories like this. Please feel free to share the link now on any of your social channels. But for now, I'm going to hand over to today's panelists, Kathy, Matt and Pete. Thanks.
Thanks, Fern. And hello from all of us. I'm going to do this first tiny little bit of talking. But first of all, a bit of a shout out to the Watershed and the PM Studio for inviting us today, and obviously the Southwest Creative Technology Network for instigating this data call. I think we're going to be kind of quite general in our comments as an intro, and then give a little bit more detail as we scroll through what we're working on individually. So the story of change and its effects on our lives is often one received with reluctance. Yet we and our environments are surrounded by change. It's just that its pace is outside our perception. These changes look set to be accelerated and become more unpredictable with climate change. Our collective goal is to capture these changes in minute detail, using various means to help us visualize and understand what we have in our natural environments and to capture these in beautiful and insightful ways. What this can also do is to create a platform to discuss the implications from the many complex perspectives involved. And also it provokes questions around loss of ecology, biodiversity, changes in coastline habitats, and the impacts of proposed developments.
There are many ways that we can measure this data, most of which connect us to the human experience and deliver systems that are designed to deliver change. In the natural world and in human health, there are connections between what we observe in nature and what we sense through other means that can change us. And from a biological perspective, at least, whether we know it or not, we seek stability. Stability helps us to adapt by giving us a reference point. We seek a new normal, whatever that happens to be at any one given time. And by sensing and adapting to our environment, we are in turn better placed to make sense and respond to further change.
We have been exploring behaviours and phenomena from the natural world, each revealing different data sets that aim to encourage the emergence of knowledge and understanding by perhaps allowing openings for less conventional agents to form data, to embrace rather than try to smooth out or reject the potential noise within data sets, and explore processes that are widely different to big data crunching algorithms. So we're each going to give a short presentation about our research so far, and I'm going to hand over to Matt to start.
Thanks, Kathy. So I'm going to talk to you today about some of the data I've been collecting with regards to light. Specifically, I'm looking at non-visual interactions with light. I'll explain a little bit more about what that means as I go on. I'm aware this sounds a little bit like some kind of self-help group, but my name is Matt and I'm a scientist, but I am trying to change just a little bit. SWCTN has given me the opportunity to embrace a more creative and less obviously structured approach to my research, to be less reductionist and to take a step back and embrace the variation in the data that I see and embrace the noise in it as well. I think it'd be useful if I explain a little bit of how I got started on this work, and hopefully that will make a bit more sense when I get to where I am now. And the abridged version is something a little bit like this. So I started out looking at vitamin D and well-being quite a few years ago, particularly how its production is influenced by sunlight and how this can impact on things like mental health. Now, in a similar way that our skin is able to sense certain forms of light and use it to produce vitamin D, we can also sense other wavelengths of light as well on top of this, mostly non-visually. And that can in turn influence our mood, our physiology, sleep patterns, creativity, our learning ability, and even our own sensitivity of our own actual conscious vision. So I've mentioned non-visual interaction with light. What actually is it? Well, it includes light within the visible spectrums. This is the light that we can see, but our response to it isn't actually due to the fact we can see it, if that makes sense. So it's basically not sensed in your retina, but it is sensed directly by other receptors, either in your skin or your blood vessels or in other areas of the eye that aren't connected to your optic nerve. It's also sensed indirectly by molecules that might be in your skin that can use the energy from the sunlight to be turned into something else. So a good example of that would be something like vitamin D or melatonin. As I mentioned before, it regulates things like mood, learning ability, blood pressure, and it's not a conscious thing. It's not something you choose to take notice of or not. It's something that your body is sensing all the time. It's not precise, but it is fairly immediate. So let's have a close look at the types of light involved. Okay, so this is just a nice picture of the light spectrum. It's kind of centered there around the visual response of the human eye in the middle there, which is around about 420 to 690 nanometers in wavelength. You can ignore the numbers from now, but essentially it means we can see somewhere from the start of the violet spectrum right the way into the red spectrum. Those forms that are shorter wavelength tend to have higher energy. So as you go into UV, they are much more higher in energy. Therefore, they can be a bit more damaging, but they don't penetrate very far into the body. Those in the other direction, in the infrared area, tend to be a lot lower in energy, or are a lot lower in energy, but can penetrate further into the body. Okay, so my normal approach would be, if I was looking into this as a research question, would be to simplify things as much as possible and pick one variable and see how it's influenced by various aspects of health. It tends to be quite reductionist. You change one thing, measure response in something else. Okay. So in order to get good data for this kind of work, we'd need to control all sorts of variables that could influence our results. So we end up with a decent set of data. So for example, if we were interested in mental health, we'd measure a particular biological marker or in an individual. So something like serotonin, which you might well know for its mood boosting properties. then we'd expose that individual to a source of light at a fixed wavelength that we know has some bearing on the production of serotonin, or we think does, for a fixed period of time. And we'd probably do this in a darkened room while they're sat perfectly still. We'd then repeat this with a whole bunch of different people and see if overall we had a change in the levels of the thing we measured before and after. And the results will probably show that we know a certain wavelength of light will influence the amount of serotonin that you produce. If we're being fancy, we might even do a few psychological questionnaires to assess mood, that kind of thing, before and after, and see if there's any correlation. But there are so many confounding variables that we would be unsure as to exactly what's going on, even in this quite simplified situation. So the new approach, what I'm doing now, I'm interested in the way that non-visual light influences the creative processes. So if I was to take this approach, I wouldn't really get very far. For example, how would you measure creativity? It's not an easy thing to do. So I've decided to look at how light as a whole has influenced creatives, artists, writers. In order to do this, I'm making use of various wearable technology that measures a number of different wavelengths of light that I'm interested in, that I know have an impact on our biochemistry. So things like vitamin D production, production of endorphins, and compounds that lower blood pressure. It's fairly early on in the research, but what I'm aiming to do towards the end is look at interviewing writers in the environments that they're describing in their work, and same idea with artists and sculptors, and really seeing whether there is a link between this non-visual sense that we experience of the world and what we actually experience visually. So actually at this stage, if anyone is interested or thinks that they might like to contribute to this, please do get in contact. There's some details at the end, it might help, and we could perhaps work on this together. So some data, some preliminary data. On the hottest day of this year, I took a few test sets of data just to see what I was working with. I wanted a space that was nothing but strong, harsh sunlight. So I went to the Royal Crescent, full sun around about 2 o'clock in the afternoon. And if you look at this data here, it's pretty hard to see what's going on. The luminance or lux, which is the brightness that your eye sense, is overriding everything. So if we take that off and go to have a look at that data without the lux on there, it might be easy to see what's going on. Essentially, what you can see here is the light sensor strapped to me as I'm moving around. When it's at its highest, I'm facing towards the direct sunlight. When it's at its lowest, I'm facing away from it. But all stages, all those readings are really quite high. And what you see is actually everything is overstimulated. The sensors actually max out, can't read anymore. And it's pretty hard to actually get much from this. Your senses are overloaded. You get the same visually as well. The UV levels, as you can see here, were very high. They were right up about as high as they actually get in the UK, almost to rarely high levels. If we then go on to look at slightly different sorts of data that I looked at, so taking my cue from sort of areas of nature writing and green spaces, and the fact that I've been reading a lot about forest bathing recently, I took a trip to the woods on the very same day. So this is about half an hour later, full sun in woodland. As before, you can see the luminance or lux in yellow there gets in the way a little bit, but everything is noticeably lower than the direct sun, which we saw in the previous data set, even when you're in a sunny patch. So if we remove that lux from the data again and look at what's left. So we have the three colors, red, green, and blue, and UV intensity. And what you can see here is it fluctuates a lot. And I would describe this more as fluctuation that you can see here rather than noise. That's mainly due to the tree canopy, shades from other areas of the wood itself. And the relative levels of the colored light also change. Blue is still the main component, but the relative levels of the red and green are increased compared to what they were in full sunlight. There's still enough UV light here to actually get a suntan or even get sunburn if you're in the sunnier patches, even though it looks like it's pretty low down on the scale. And if you look at the sensors, nothing's ever saturated. It's much more gentle. So in summary, it's kind of like the relative levels have changed, and it's more of a tickling of the senses rather than the kick in the face that you saw with the light data earlier on. So what does this actually mean? Well, can the light data tell its own story? I mentioned before about the human condition and the fact that we are best place to react to changes once we adapt to the new normal. And these changes that we see here are small changes. They're very small, but probably have more of an effect than we would see if everything was maxed out, which is what we saw in full sunlight. It has implications for a whole bunch of different creative processes, what we actually see in these environments and how they impact us and our mood. And it also has a lot wider implications. I know some of the talks in previous weeks have looked at things like immersive VR. Something like this would have huge implications for immersive VR when you are purely basing it on vision, but actually there's a whole host of other senses from light that again would be impacted on this. So this, as I said before, this is at fairly early stages, this research, and it hopefully will grow a bit more. Again, if people are wanting to volunteer or are interested in working with me on this, I'd be happy to hear from you at the end. So I'm going to hand over to Kathy now to talk about her work on one of the other elements.
Thanks very much, Matt. That was really interesting. So I'm going to give a bit of a talk about my research, and I would say I'm going to play a few bits of sound, and if you do happen to have headphones to hand, that might help because it's quite subtle. Okay, so I'm an audiovisual artist, and the artworks I make aim to open up opportunities to explore our relationship with the natural world, often through installations, site-specific works, performances, and participatory listening walks. So one of the starting points for my data research grew from a series of projects that involved listening to waterways. So very briefly, I'll start by outlining a project from 2015, which I did with Cryptic in Glasgow, which was centred around the streams of Glasgow, which are actually called burns in Scotland. I invited local people on walks to listen to the burns through the city. On these walks, we followed the burn and we paused to listen to the water together using hydrophones, which are microphones designed to listen underwater. We also worked with community scientists, and we took part in a citizen science water survey and also sent samples of water to a science lab for really detailed analysis. So I received a lot of data in return from that. And with this data and the underwater recordings, I created an interactive sound map where the underwater sounds are layered within a submerged map interface and can be listened to by a touch interface, with options to also further filter the sound based on the scientific data that I've received. So when I'm reflecting on this project, it occurred to me that those prolonged periods of listening to water as a group felt like the core of the work. This very focused listening, this tuning in live to our surroundings, whilst physically connecting with a water body together, was really key. It was very contemplative and still, with no talking for long periods of time whilst we listened attentively, with reflections and sharings happening whilst we meandered from one part of the burn to the next. And these long durations seemed to feel crucial, and we were gaining a kind of embodied knowledge, which takes time. We often found ourselves on the outskirts of the city, exploring unusual spaces. We privileged the often ignored parts of the city and had to circumnavigate blockages to the flow of the burns, which highlighted interruptions that had happened due to city planning that lacked a sympathetic approach to the natural surroundings. And we began perceiving our everyday surroundings in a much more engaged manner. And we actually discovered a burn that was culverted directly beneath a park, which fed into some local appeals to daylight this burn, to open it up to the world and let it breathe, which can really help increase biodiversity and also alleviate risk of flooding. So that was kind of one of the side impacts of this project. So along with the water surveying that is already in place through various environmental monitoring agencies that gathers data, it seemed to me that focused listening sessions to streams and water bodies could be very beneficial to the ongoing health and to the survey of these water bodies. So leaping forwards now to my data fellowship with SWCTN, I propose to extend my research with water and data and to find new ways and methods to uncover and reveal different data sets, drawing again on methods from my artistic practice. My intention was again to start my process through listening, and I wanted to do a series of participatory listening walks to get to know the rivers and waterways of Bristol in new ways and to further investigate this process, to collect audio data and to open up a collaborative context for further knowledge or data to emerge through the process. However, due to COVID-19, I had to rethink this a little bit as participatory events weren't really on the menu. So with many creative processes I employ, I wanted to engage with non-deterministic processes and to create some conditions for improvisation to open up possibilities for ideas and processes to emerge. And it was important to try and adopt a non-anthropocentric perspective. So I decided I would try to collaborate with the river on how to collectively generate and reveal data sets together. I began by making some hydrophone recordings, and here is a short extract from In the Depths of the River Froome. So hopefully you could hear that, and there's like lots of tiny little sounds that are invertebrates living in the river, and of course the movement of the water. So the combination of art forms is actually a key aspect of my practice, as is the tactile experience of engaging with physical materials through the craft of making. So when I was recording, I found myself wading right into the river to listen to different areas. And I discovered small bits of algae, river plants and sediment from the riverbed stayed with me when I waded back out again. I decided to gather some of these materials and consequently made an attempt to reveal more about them through a further interaction with 16mm film. So I gathered some sediment and plant matter from the river and brought them into my makeshift darkroom, which is actually the back of my van. And I laid them out directly onto the surface of the film and exposed them with a torchlight. And I then developed the film using an eco-processing concoction called cathinol, which is a recipe of instant coffee, the cheap kind, vitamin C and washing soda, which I've learnt about from being part of BEEF, Bristol Experimental Expanded Film. So physical traces are generated through a direct encounter between the material qualities of the river particles and the film itself, creating a photogram film. This process also generates sound through the exposure of the optical soundtrack of the film, which provides another opportunity for listening, this time to the shadows and the traces of river particles. So for the moment, I've actually just made a digital edit of this analog film, and I've mixed in some of the underwater recordings of the same part of the river to make an audiovisual trace of the River Froome. I've got plans for more experiments, such as exposing the film immersed in the river at night with a flashlight, and also allowing the faster flowing parts of the river to physically change some of the already developed photogram films to allow weathering and abrasion from the movement of the water flow to remove and fragment parts of this photogram image. And what I found also really interesting, that I've done all of this within 1 mile of my house, which has been a very interesting contrast to my pre-COVID life when I used to travel a lot. It was actually always my intention with this research to focus locally, but this has obviously become much more intense. I've been exploring what's under my nose. However, I don't feel like I've been narrowing down, but instead zooming in. And I seem to have expanded my observations by exploring, searching and magnifying. And there seems to be no end to my fascination with just one part of the River Froome. There is so much there to discover. Perhaps an interesting comparison to what Matt was saying earlier about not wanting to be reductionist, but to expand out and use a wider lens. And I think perhaps I'm doing both. So with these experiments, I've tried to hand over some of the data gathering, forming and shaping to material processes. And I like the idea of letting something else form the data, for this to be a process far removed from a computer algorithm trained on big data. My choice to prioritize the eco-processing of data is also a reaction to the energy-thirsty computer processing requirements of crunching big data. And I've also been thinking about how the actual process of these enactments holds so much interest for me. And perhaps that's where a lot of the knowledge lies. I do often listen to the hydrophone without recording, and I wonder, do I need to capture the data, or can I simply experience it? Listen, but not press record. Let it pass. To experience ephemeral data that is always changing. To know it is there, but without the need to freeze it in time. In a world obsessed with storing, backing up, gathering, monitoring, and hoarding, which all does actually absorb a huge amount of energy. And another aspect of working with data on computers is the process of smoothing the data. It's often implemented to make sense or to map or to use the data, to try and take away the noise. And I've been thinking about allowing the messiness of the data set to be. I'm going to find a way of working with this scenario. And perhaps the noise could be the most interesting aspect of some data sets. So whatever the case, I've really enjoyed the messiness of making this film. And here is a short extract, which Martin is going to play. So that's just a short extract, and the full, still quite short edit will be on show at Mutec Festival in their virtual gallery next week. And those are the dates and details on screen now and the website link. So it's from the 8th to the 13th of September and still on their website until the 20th. And then I'm going to make a multi-screen installation version of this work at a group show with Beef at the Centre of Gravity exhibition at Soapworks in the former Gardner Haskins store in Bristol. And that's on for the whole of October. And then also quite soon, next month, I'm going to be running a participatory deep listening walk at the Harbourside in Bristol. And that's part of the Control Shift Festival and will take place on Saturday, the 10th of October. So do go to the Control Shift Network website to check that out and come and join. And without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Pete Finn Davis.
Thanks, Kathy and Matt. Some lovely, lovely things there. I think what I'm going to talk about here, I've got about 6 slides and then we're going to play a little trailer at the end. But I'm going to talk more contextually, kind of about how works are created and I suppose what the atmosphere around works is. My works generally kind of explore a variety of media that includes photography, digital fabrication, scanning, sculpture, design, and film. And the main themes of that are seriality, materiality, and digital ephemera. Sometimes contentious, the idea of digital ephemera, but I like kind of exploring temporal themes like ideas of time, space, history, and memory, and how these concepts relate and intersect. In normal conditions, the kind of practice would investigate the formation of historical dissemination of cultural constructs around natural, cultural, and the technological world. But for this early part of the data fellowship work, I've used technology's virtual capabilities in order to reproduce a heightened experience of landscape, and in this case, a tree, thus addressing the subjective and mediated condition of any first-hand encounter. I think for me, technology both enables and limits our perception and experience of the worlds we inhabit. I'm using Lidar scanning to make these digital presences. And for those unfamiliar with what that is, it's a form of machine vision that potentially could replace photography, but that's kind of a massive other story. It's really the electronic eyes for billions of mobile phones, iPads, driverless vehicles. And you could say that 3D scanners are the new cartographers of the future. Using terrestrial LiDAR technology, it's now possible to capture the world in 3 dimensions. This technology can create near perfect digital 3D replicas of buildings, landscapes, objects, and events. And by critically observing places and events through the eyes of these machines, we can potentially glance at the future which we will all inhabit. I'm going to talk particularly about one specific work that is still in the process of being edited, so it's always a little bit difficult to formulate some proper kind of understanding of what really is going on because it's a work in progress. But it is directly related to the COVID-19 pandemic. Obviously, our travel and connections have been so limited and have transformed temporary moments and spaces into these compelling permanent experiences. And that was kind of one of the initial ideas about how to get this data fellowship underway. The online environment for all of us has been very different, and it's made me rethink what immersive installation and the experience of real objects is and could be like. I think it's made us rethink our own time and what this temporality, this new temporality means or feels like. I read an interview last week with the artist Elizabeth Price, and I think she kind of encapsulates an understanding of kind of what was really going on during this COVID effect. And she says, I guess all kinds of political consequences have come home in the crisis. There are impacts of austerity, the privatization of the NHS. Others have become more visible, but are long-standing, deeper, like the impacts of structural racism, meaning the epidemic is more dangerous to some than others. And here in Bristol, these effects have been keenly felt. Some artists and writers have found lockdown freeing. With plans cancelled, time has been opened up for concentrated work, and it's become, as Kathy was saying, and Matt actually, hyper-local. Others have found it paralyzing. What does the world mean now? And I'm sure it will take time for what's going on to make any kind of sense at all. But it feels like there's a letter in the post to all of us, but it kind of hasn't arrived yet, or its arrival keeps being put off. And I think all this commentary and experience going on, it's going to be good to focus on a small natural object, which I have done, that has connection to us, but it also is separate from us. I became fascinated by a young tree on the banks of the Tamar. It's a birch tree. I started scanning this with a large format scanner. And as the process unfolded, it was a very quiet experience, very solitary. But when I brought the data back into the studio, some parallels became apparent to me that created an equivalence or a metaphor for what I was looking at, for how I was experiencing these images, reflecting on these measurements, seeing the natural phenomenon of a growing, breathing tree. And as the Lidar scans were processed, this takes a kind of huge amount of time. I was struck by how these digital replicas are always an illusion of perfection. And that something that Kathy and Matt was also saying, that the noise, the error disruptions can sometimes throw up unexpected moments of real insight. And these change the inherent curated feel of modern technologies. These moments are when technology is glitching, it's kind of overloaded, or the computations are too big or huge. We sometimes begin to see the kind of unedited kind of view of the world as seen through the eyes of the Lidar machine or any other technology. Reality is shrouded in a cloud of kind of mistaken measurements, confused surfaces, misplaced three-dimensional reflections and movements. But it seems oddly, particularly to me, to kind of make more sense. When the scans were first made in March, the tree was not in leaf. So at the beginning of the COVID-19. When the scans were finished in June, obviously the tree was in leaf, and I'm in the process of kind of merging these two together, connecting the physical data with hopefully the psychological or emotional way we feel about nature. The work has been produced when most of our ecosystems are particularly fragile. Immersed in the middle of this kind of digital forest, we have a natural world that needs protecting. And COVID-19 could provide a moment to recast work and demonstrate the urgent need for us to maybe radically rethink environments, climate and biodiversity, to create environments that are sustainable, just and resilient in the face of the probable shocks to come, and to enhance this very local feel. I kind of reached out to Kathy, whose specialism is sound, to go through a very similar process in her local area, dealing with sound on a local tree that was next, very close to her house. I'm going to play a trailer of the work in progress, and I hope you've got some kind of headphones because the sound is particularly rich, and bring in Kathy afterwards to talk through how we will and have collaborated in our two separate locations and how this fitted conceptually tightly with both the way we were thinking and feeling through this particularly strange times in what played out to be exactly 101 days.
Thanks very much for playing that. It's really wonderful. and some of those details on the scans just look so incredible and fascinating. So I was really, really excited when Pete invited me to collaborate with him on this project to make some sound. And it seemed really fitting that during lockdown, we worked remotely, but also physically, locally within our local area. And this combination of the real physical and the digital merging, as we both spend time with a specific tree and then shape the information that we gather using digital audiovisual tools. So here's a slide showing a little bit of my recording technique. So I've used hydrophones again, but this time with a special adapter to convert it into a contact microphone that is highly sensitive and picks up sound being conducted through materials and objects that it's in contact with. So I was able to listen in to the very subtle and usually inaudible sounds from within the tree. So I could hear it slowly moving in the wind, and then I could also hear the sounds of the surrounding area kind of through the material substance of the tree itself. And then I could also, when I put the hydrophone right into the roots, I could hear the tiny inhabitants living beneath the bark and amongst the root structures. So these kind of close listening processes tie in really closely to what I was talking about earlier. And so the soundtrack that I've made uses these sounds of the tree, trying to sort of tie certain textures to the visual dynamics of Pete's video. And I've also mixed in some sounds of my own breath, just in the section where the tree leaves are part of the scan. And we've also got some ideas about how we might use some air quality data from those 101 days between Pete's Lidar scans, and for this data to somehow affect the audio. And in the bigger term, one of the ambitions we do have for this work is to project it at a very large scale outdoors, because it's a very high resolution image. And the sound is quite detailed and has subtle shifts and changes, so it would work really well, possibly on wireless headphones as an outdoor projection piece, or on a big PA, of course. And another aim is to perhaps work towards a live audiovisual performance where the audio and visual material can be mixed live, and also we could possibly then think even more about working with different data streams and actually listening to what Matt was doing today, taking light readings from these points where the trees are could be really interesting. So yeah, it was an absolute pleasure to collaborate on that so far, and we're still working on it. And now I'm going to hand back over to Fern, and we're going to take some questions, I think.
Hi everyone, that was absolutely brilliant. I love hearing about all your work so much. I just find it so inspiring. And so I guess the first question, I know you sort of touched on it briefly, but what is the next step for each of you on your projects?
I don't know who wants to go first.
Matt, you go first.
So I have a few interviews lined up with writers over the next couple of weeks. Once I've got the risk assessments done for talking to people in the real world. And I'm going to I've just also received a bunch of new light sensors as well. So I've got sort of ideas for sort of structured interviews with these creatives in the environments where they create. And much as people were looking at some of those images earlier on of the trees and things, but actually doing that in situ and getting people to sort of, comment on what it was about that particular environmental situation which impacted on their writing or their art in any way, and at the same time take some light measurements as well and see if there's any sort of overlap between the two.
Yeah, well, I mean, actually also in my talk I said I want to just continue this backwards and forwards process with making these films from the river and then taking them back to the river to see if that affects them, and to maybe work with some different sections of the river. I'd actually quite like to walk the whole river Froome as an experience and see what kind of ideas that throws up. And then also I'm really keen to sort of work towards some way of representing this. I'd actually really like to try and do an outdoor screening with the 16mm film and the sound, like very close to where I recorded it. So I'm thinking about those things. And then also I've got a lot more ideas that I want to do with the tree, because I'm quite interested in also gathering audio information, but from using sensors. So I think you can like find ways of working on ways of measuring the transpiration of the tree, like how much the water kind of passes through the tree and comes up through the leaves. And so I think there's interesting things that I can work on there to kind of gather different data to convert into sound, or that could just literally make sound from the electrical kind of conductance between different parts of the tree.
Yeah, I think we'll be working on the final edit of the tree, which probably will end up around kind of 9 minutes and potentially would be looped. But we're looking at different ways of projecting it. So we're thinking of upturning the projectors the other way, so it almost looks like the tree is breathing, hence the kind of breathing of Kathy's breath. So they're almost like kind of huge two lungs kind of just working. We're thinking about projecting it across water, all sorts of kind of ideas. But generally, kind of I'm working on different landscapes at the moment, kind of Lidar scanning some quarry pits down in Cornwall and looking at, I suppose, how resilient or non-resilient our landscapes are when you actually measure them in the relationship to climate change and what is happening to our environments. But trying to work, I suppose, creatively with Lidar and giving it a kind of storytelling capability, which is sometimes difficult to do with Lidar because it kind of looks so ghostly and haunted. You know, it kind of doesn't look like sometimes that it's alive, and yet it's measured 360. So yeah, busy.
That all sounds so amazing. I can't wait. Melissa in the chat asked, how has lockdown affected your research process?
Well, I think I kind of mentioned it in the talk really, and I think one of my blog posts for the SWCTN group has really been about, I suppose, what it meant to work in isolation in many ways. I mean, we've never, as a group, we've never met physically. So, which has been weird and incredible, but it's also thrown up collaborations, hence the one with Kathy and other people. But it's also kind of made us communicate actually in a slightly different way. It's been constraining, but also in some ways liberating.
Yeah, so I mean, I guess one big part of my initial proposal was to do these participatory walks. So, and that was like really key for me, to be connecting with people local to those areas. And I do hope to be able to do that kind of later on in the year or in the future. And so that threw me a little bit, but also what I found really amazing, well, actually, I kind of found that through joining the data fellowship, the big thing for me for like the first sort of month or so was really reading lots around the sort of things we were discussing, and also talking to lots of different data fellows. And I think because of the really interdisciplinary like range of people's specialisms, that was absolutely fascinating. So I didn't really start my water research till quite a way in. I mean, I imagined just starting it straight away, but somehow I just didn't feel I could quite get into it, and I didn't know quite how to approach it. And I found so many of the discussions within our workshops really important, and lots of things relating to the pandemic, and also the kind of like other injustices that have kind of risen to highlight because of the pandemic, and sort of things being amplified by biased data, and all those kinds of things have been really important to kind of engage with. So that's all been kind of going on as well alongside this research, and thinking about how that kind of research can also impact the work that I make, and how that, you know, can have an impact.
I think sort of similar to what both Pete and Kathy were saying, it's made the whole process more collaborative. We're talking to lots of people, but at the same time, the actual data collection part of things has been a lot more solitary. And I've spent a lot of time wandering around the woods with no real place to go, just sort of aimlessly wandering around, which has worked out really well for what I want to do. Perhaps wouldn't have worked so well if I had an intention to go somewhere. And so things like that have been quite useful. It's also the fact that, as Pete said, it's been really local, that I've been making use of the surroundings near to me. I didn't have it anywhere in mind, particularly where I was going to collect data, but it has been within, a couple of miles from my home, just because it's worked so easy to get to, and it's a lot safer. But I think overall, I know sort of COVID-19 is kind of the equivalent of the dog ate my homework at the moment for most people, but I think it really has given us as a group of people, as fellows, a chance to talk about other things and go off on tangents that perhaps we wouldn't have done if we'd have just got on with things straight away.
Yeah, that I agree. It has given kind of a bit more time for thinking, hasn't it, as well? I really loved what Kathy said in not narrowing down, but zooming in. And Martin has a question for Matt. How do you feel working like this can feed back into your more traditional scientific work, and will it change your approach?
I think it already has. It's changed my thinking in that initially everything has had to have a purpose, and the data collection, for example, just wandering aimlessly around the forest with a light detector strapped to me. I think previously I would have been sort of walking to certain patches saying, oh, this bit over here looks like it'll give me good data. So I've been sort of a little bit less guided. It's still structured, but just not so obviously so. I'm probably going to use a lot of this data in a more traditional sense at some point, but I haven't worked out how yet. And I don't think I can really, although I've tried, I've been able to let go of things completely, and just, the scientist is still there, I'm afraid.
And then we've got one for Kathy and Pete from Natasha. I like the way you have collaborated remotely with sound and image from sites local to you. Do you think this will inspire you more working this way in the future?
I think from my perspective, it's been a kind of liberating experience. It's always good to work with another creative. Their vision is always different from your own. And those types of collaboration draw people closer together, but they also make work stronger, because the acceptance of the finished product is sometimes greater than the sum of its parts.
I mean, I think, as artists, we're always ready to adapt to the situations we find ourselves in. So I don't know if this is, I really have missed sort of meeting other artists in person, because I'm often traveling to different festivals. And also it's kind of strange to have met all these wonderful, lovely new people, but only digitally. So yeah, it's worked really, really well. And I think it has been kind of fascinating, because we've had these really intensive chats about ideas and shared material, but then we've been going off on our own. So yeah, it did work really well, but I'd like to meet you at some point, Pete. That'd be nice, and maybe visit your tree, and you could visit.
I know, it's quite funny, with two separate trees in two completely different biospheres, or in micro biospheres.
But yeah. I think also in the work, this kind of like becomes a very kind of digital piece, as in the outcome of this audiovisual projection, but it's from these very sort of durational solitary moments with these trees in our different locations.
We've been talking a lot about digitization processes, and particularly that Kathy was mentioning, the storage of data, and how peculiar it is, because actually the storage is a very physical presence. But because we call it the cloud, we think that it's in the cloud, and it's kind of not of this earth. But we were talking actually earlier this morning about the rise exponentially of data storage across the world, and I mean it's extraordinary.
I think we've just got one last question from Up Down Electron. Love different types of data producing different ways of knowing. do you find there's a sort of unspoken hierarchy of data types that people pay attention to in science and art that needs to change?
Good question. I think one of the things that's highlighted from a lot of the workshops we've been doing as a fellowship group is that there's, data is never neutral. There is always a bias and a lens that it's being read from. And I think that there needs to be much more awareness of that and questioning, because I think sometimes scientific data, when it's presented with a bias, could just be taken as like so much more accurate than removes human bias, but it actually can really accentuate it. So I just think there needs to be definitely more awareness of that in terms of perceptions and how it's delivered to people.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question, that one, because it's really about the question between small and big data as well. So I kind of feel our data is big, but it's also small because it's kind of local and very, very finely focused, but it deals with data in a very physical way. Whereas the kind of government understanding of data is huge. It's big. It's about consensus and change, but these changes are not always directed in the right way. So hierarchies and stereotypes of data develop. That's what happens.
Yeah, I think it's much like society itself, that within those particular areas or groups, people will hold quite different opinions and different ideas of what the hierarchy of data might be. And it's just down to the individual, really, that a certain person in a certain area would, regard certain data differently to someone else. But at the same time, if you're open to it, you can just take it on its merits. That's essentially the best approach you can have. But then if you're in an environment where there is one major view, then you tend to start off with that view, whether you like it or not, and it can take time to sort of develop other ideas as well.
I just wanted to add something else with the art side of things, in that I think some of the things we've been talking about in terms of durational experiencing whatever data or knowledge over a period of time, where the situation you're in, it might be a walk, it might be something that takes a long time to absorb, and it might have ambiguities, I think gives your mind a different way to process that data and maybe take longer on your formulation of how you're reading it, absorbing it, and making your own sort of opinion of it. So I think these sort of embodied, it may be immersive experiences can be really helpful in terms of taking away that kind of snap decision of, oh, that means that and that means that, and then not really sort of fully questioning it and thinking about it. So
amazing. Just want to say thank you again to the three of you. It's been such a wonderful talk, and we'll be sharing updates and all sorts of things that all our fellows get up to on our Twitter, which I think there'll be links for in the description. And just a reminder that next week's talk is Data and the Human. In this panel, we'll be exploring the human relationship with data as a mirror, from how it helps us understand ourselves and others to the consequences of data misrepresenting us or exposing aspects of ourselves we may want to keep private. And don't forget, you can get all the news on all the future talks by following us on the PM Studio UK on Twitter, or at Pervasive Media Studio on Instagram, or subscribing to our newsletter on our website. And also, if you have an idea for your own lunchtime talk, drop us a line and let us know what you want to talk about. But for now, thanks for watching, and we'll see you again here next week.